welcome to DD India. I'm Munmun Bhattacharya and you're watching Connecting the Dots, a show that does a deep dive and connects the dots to get you the big picture of raging global issues. In this edition, we take a look at China's plan to dominate the world through its Belt and Road Initiative and explore if its end game is nearing. In December 2023, Italy made it official. After toying with the idea and dropping hints for months, Italy finally told China it is pulling out of the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy had joined BRI in 2019. When it did so, it became the first and so far the only G7 nation to sign up for it. Now with its exit, there will be no G7 nation left under the BRI umbrella. So why has Italy walked out of the BRI? Before we get there, let's take a look at what is the BRI and when and how did it start. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global infrastructure network of ports, roads, railways and other infrastructure. It all started 10 years ago when in 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed the idea in a speech in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. He talked about building a new trade route based on the old Silk Road. What is the old Silk Road? It is an ancient network that linked Asia, Middle East and Europe for almost 2,000 years. So what is the Belt and what is the road in the Belt and Road Initiative? For China, Belt meant overland routes that connected to Europe through Central Asia and also to South Asia and Southeast Asia. And road meant a maritime network that links China to major ports through Asia to Africa and Europe. Initially, BRI was referred to as two separate projects. Then it came to be known as the One Belt, One Road Initiative. And then finally, it was the Belt and Road Initiative. So where does the BRI stand today? Well, the original idea of BRI was to link East Asia and Europe through physical infrastructure. But in the last 1 decade, the project went well beyond. It expanded to the continents of Africa, Oceania, and Latin America. Today, almost 150 countries are part of BRI. That is 3/4 of all the countries in the world, and over $1 trillion have already been invested in BRI projects. Most of that investment has been made into energy and transport projects such as power plants and railways. This is how the BRI network looks like. The grey lines show existing railways, the purple lines show planned or under construction railways, the grey dots show key stations, the green dots show the maritime road, and the yellow dots show the economic belt. So how did China sell the idea of BRI to so many countries? China touted it as an economic win-win. It told countries that these investments will stimulate development. At home, it sold the project as a way to help Chinese companies boost the Chinese economy and improve China's reputation. So how does BRI work? Who lends the money for BRI projects and how are loans repaid? As per Aid Data Research Lab at William & Mary, a university in the US state of Virginia, China has established itself as the financier of first resort for many low-income and middle-income countries. Over an 18-year-long period, China granted or loaned money to over 13,000 infrastructure projects worth well over $800 billion across 165 countries. Much of this money is linked to China's BRI strategy. China uses debt rather than aid to have a dominant position in the international development finance market. So its loans are 31 times more than its grants. The average loan from China has a 4.2% interest rate, a grace period of less than 2 years, and maturity length of less than 10 years. These are less generous terms than what multilateral creditors offer. Collateralization is Beijing's go-to risk mitigation tool, the linchpin of China's high-risk, high-reward credit allocation strategy. So where does it leave the borrower countries? Well, 42 countries now have levels of public debt exposure to China in excess of 10% of their GDP. These debts are systematically underreported to the World Bank's debtor reporting system. So this is essentially hidden debt. To put it simply, there is a veil of secrecy around Chinese loans. China does not disclose the terms of its loans, even though most of the major industrialized nations share information about their lending activities. They do so through their membership of what's known as the Paris Club. But China has chosen not to join this grouping. So do borrower countries fall in a debt trap laid by China? Yes, they do. This Associated Press report shows how China's loans are pushing world's poorest countries to the brink of collapse. So why is that happening? That is happening because Chinese loans are harder to pay. China tends to lend at higher rates of interest than Western governments. So Chinese interest rates are higher and repayment has to be done faster. So then why do countries opt for Chinese loans that are harder to pay? Because China gives the loans with fewer strings attached. Chinese loans are less onerous than offers from global lenders or the West. China shows up with a one-stop approach. It says, here are our banks and companies, and we do everything from start to finish. And if you sign today, we will finish that railway, and it will be done in time, just as you campaign for your next election. Yes, you heard that right. A lot of countries take the bait. And in a lot of them, ruling politicians decide to have projects where it suits them politically, even if that does not make any economic or commercial sense. So if you look at the list of BRI projects and who is in power, you will often see a connection. In Sri Lanka, with elections on his mind, the then President Mahinda Rajapaksa opened the Hambantota port in an elaborate celebration in 2010. Sri Lanka borrowed billions from China to develop this major port in Rajapaksa's home district on Sri Lanka's southeastern coast. But when Sri Lanka struggled to pay back the money, it ended up with a new deal. That deal gave China control of the port for 99 years. So Beijing got the port in exchange for debt relief. That's not all. There are more countries in the world that are struggling with BRI debt. Djibouti, Laos, Zambia and Kyrgyzstan have debts to China equivalent to at least 20% of the GDP. Zambia and Sri Lanka defaulted. In Pakistan, millions of textile workers had to be laid off because the country has too much foreign debt and can't even afford to keep the electricity on and machines running. Unless China begins to soften its stance on its loans to poor countries, there could be a wave of more defaults and political upheavals. But China refuses to forgive debt in most cases. A case study of how it has played out is in Zambia, a landlocked country of 20 million people in southern Africa that over the past 2 decades borrowed billions of dollars from Chinese state-owned banks to build dams, railways and roads. The loans raised its foreign interest payments so high that there was little left for the government, forcing it to cut spending on healthcare, social services and subsidies to farmers. In the past, under such circumstances, big government lenders such as the US, Japan and France would work out deals to forgive some debt. But China didn't play by those rules. By November 2020, with little reserves left, Zambia stopped paying the interest on foreign loans and defaulted, locking it out of future borrowing and setting off a vicious cycle of spending cuts and deepening poverty. Inflation in Zambia has since soared 50%, unemployment has hit a 17-year high, and the nation's currency, the kwacha, has lost 30% of its value in just 7 months. United Nations estimates 3.5 million Zambians are not getting enough food. China's unwillingness to take big losses on the hundreds of billions of dollars it is owed, despite urgings by the IMF and the World Bank, has left many countries on a treadmill of paying back interest, which stifles the economic growth that would help them pay off the debt. If this is not a debt trap, what is? So how are countries that have taken BRI debt from China dealing with this debt trap? Well, some have wriggled out. They have either walked out of BRI or scrapped or scaled back BRI projects. For instance, West African country Sierra Leone scrapped a BRI project in 2018. It was a $318 billion airport deal with China. In the same year, the then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad announced cancellation of Chinese projects worth several billions of dollars. So what is in it for China? What does China really want through BRI? China wants to dominate the world through trade, investments, infrastructure and debt via government-to-government deals that are clinched without competitive bidding. It wants to expand its sphere of geostrategic and military influence. It wants to control the domestic and foreign policies of its BRI partners to achieve that. Talking of the Indian Ocean region, China wants to expand its military and strategic presence there by leasing, seizing, controlling or acquiring ports in the region, among other tactics. In other words, in its immediate neighborhood, China wants to encircle India through a string of pearls. We will tell you how it is doing that. Beijing has leveraged big credits to gain military presence in the East African country Djibouti. Here, China built its first overseas full-fledged naval base in the Horn of Africa in 2017. How did that happen? Djibouti was trapped in a debt crisis after borrowing billions of dollars from China, and it was left with no choice but to lease land for the base to China. So China controls a naval base in Djibouti. And what about Maldives? China has acquired several islets in this heavily indebted Indian Ocean archipelago of Maldives. China controls the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, as you know. China acquired the Gwadar port in Pakistan's Balochistan province in 2013. So those are just some of the pearls in China's string of pearls strategy. That's not all. This 8-data study of March 2021 is the first systematic analysis of the legal terms of China's foreign lending and has found out something alarming. It says clauses in Chinese contracts potentially allow the lenders to influence debtors' domestic and foreign policies, a point that we had made earlier. This report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, an independent think tank on defense and security issues, says China pressures foreign governments to pursue policies that are to its liking. That is evident in Chinese actions at the United Nations and also how it arm twists many European Union members to block or water down policies that are critical of it. That's not all. The think tank draws a connect between BRI and Chinese coercive tactics around Taiwan. Listen to this excerpt. The BRI has been one of China's main instruments to push governments that maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan to drop these ties and instead engage with Beijing and accept loans and investments. No surprise then that virtually all nations that have shifted recognition from Taiwan to China in the past decade are BRI recipients. So that's how China has been using BRI to flex its muscles and arm twist its BRI partners. So now let's go back to the earlier question that we raised. Why has Italy walked out of BRI? 1. It did not make economic sense for Italy to continue in BRI. Italy had joined the BRI at a time it was desperate for investment and infrastructure building, having survived 3 recessions in 10 years. Its government at that time did not share warm relations with the EU. It was happy to turn to China for the funds it could pump in. 4 years later, the agreement hasn't done much for Italy. Look at these figures from Council on Foreign Relations. China lapped up more gains than Italy did since their BRI collaboration. 2. Changing geopolitics. The reason surely is not just economic. Many countries in Europe have hardened their stand towards China because of the Russia-Ukraine war, China's staunch support of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and geopolitical rivalries that have taken the form of trade sanctions. Italy too has been gradually hardening its stand against Beijing, especially after Meloni came to power. What's more, Italy has the G7 presidency in 2024, and walking out of the BRI sits well with its Western allies. So what is India's stand on the BRI? India does not support the BRI. It has refused to join it. The major reason for this is that the BRI passes through Indian territory illegally held by Pakistan. The arm of the BRI project that links mainland China to the Arabian Sea runs from Kashgar in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to Gwadar Port in southwestern Balochistan in Pakistan. The project enters Indian territory occupied by Pakistan and Gilgit-Baltistan and traverses the entire length of Pakistan from north to south before reaching the Arabian Sea. This arm of the BRI is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, and consists of multiple modern highway and railway projects. While India has always opposed CPEC for violating its territorial integrity and sovereignty, its opposition extends to the whole of BRI. India has boycotted BRI summits held by China. India has not endorsed BRI joint statements issued by SCO either. India says BRI projects should respect international norms, rule of law, financial sustainability, and not create a debt trap or environmental and social risks for host countries. The CPEC, by the way, is largely stuck because China is refusing to fund fresh projects in Pakistan due to lack of progress on the corridor and also because of Islamabad's failure to honor its financial obligations. Locals are unhappy because China relies on Chinese workers for much of the construction work. Also, Chinese workers have been targeted in terror attacks. So what is the future of the BRI? Is its end game nearing? China of late has been singing a different tune of small and beautiful. It is finding it difficult to sustain BRI funding, so it is focusing on what it calls low investment and high yield projects. China has cut down financing. It has imposed limits on external lending by Chinese banks. That's a very clear indication that BRI has become unsustainable for China. If BRI is in dire straits, what are the other alternatives for building world-class green infrastructure that supports developing countries particularly? 1. PGII. At the G7 summit in 2021, US President Joe Biden, together with other G7 countries, launched B3W, or the Build Back Better World Initiative. To draw a contrast with BRI, the emphasis was on transparency, good governance, the environment, and bringing in the private sector to help fund it all. 1 year later, it got a new name, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII. So in 2022, it was officially launched as a joint initiative to help fund infrastructure projects in developing countries through public and private investments. 2. Global Gateway. French President Emmanuel Macron had suggested during a 2018 trip to China that the BRI could make partner countries quote-unquote vassal states, or subordinate states in layman terms. 3 years later, in December 2021, EU announced Global Gateway, a $300 billion infrastructure investment program for the world. 3. AAGC. Together with India, Japan has agreed to cultivate the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, a plan to develop and connect ports from Myanmar to East Africa. 4. IMEC. At the G20 summit in New Delhi in September 2023, India pushed for the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, and got on board the UAE, Saudi Arabia, US and European nations such as Germany, France and Italy. As the name suggests, IMEC will connect India, the Middle East and Europe via connectivity projects. 5. International North-South Transport Corridor. But to be a viable alternative to BRI, all these projects need to work on their financial muscle, accessibility, affordability, speed and scale. Now the question is, with these alternatives to BRI available, will countries, particularly in the developing world, cast their lot with an autocratic China? Or will they want to do business with democracies instead? This is a call that the developing world needs to take. Time for a breather on connecting the dots. Coming up on the other side, is a silent infertility epidemic beginning to slowly engulf the human race?